You're good.
Let me know.
And the Q&A and the whole thing.
All right, for those of you who have just started watching the recording, welcome. I was going to say that earlier too, but I would just like to know, I was talking about Thomas Sowell with my friends before, and I wanted to know how many of you have actually ever heard of him, either before this event or before I told you about him? Okay, there we go. So, you'll definitely all learn something, so that's a good thing. We don't always learn things in class, but yeah. You should. And for the people online, if you can hear me, for the people online who can hear me, we all know how bad watching videos over Zoom is. So just go to YouTube and type in Common Sense in a Senseless World and just watch the video and then like mute us. And then when you're done watching it, because I'll let you know when we're gonna start watching it.
I'm sharing it, screen sharing it.
But usually it gets slowed down. So if you're having trouble,
You get frame rate issues.
Yeah, frame rate issues. So
I will
if you have those troubles, just watch it independently. So I guess, does anybody have any questions? Otherwise, I guess we'll just get started.
This whole notion that the black family has always been disintegrating, that is nonsense. That his studies go up to 1925. The great bulk of black families were intact, two-parent families up through 1925, and going all the way back through the era of slavery. So it is now only within our own time that we suddenly see this inevitable tragedy, which the welfare system says it's going to rush in to solve.
It's been 40 years since the show aired, and Thomas Sowell's writings continue to illuminate. Whether the topic is race, crime, immigration, or so many other subjects, his scholarship remains as relevant as ever.
Racists may prefer one race to another, but they prefer themselves to everybody else.
Thomas Sowell is a trained economist. He's a sociologist who has written books about virtually every culture that's ever existed. He is a photographer. He is America's greatest contemporary living philosopher.
I'm Jason Riley. I'm a journalist and author. For more than 2 decades, I have closely studied the life and work of Thomas Sowell. His story is both fascinating and illuminating.
Tom makes a very, very good point that general principles affect everybody, whether they're black, brown, or purple.
Tom is fearless not just in advancing unpopular opinions, but in venturing into areas of scholarship that had been untrodden.
Tom Sowell is known for his views on economics, history, race, and politics. But I've also discovered some lesser-known aspects of his life. His research and his writings about late-talking children, and the fact that he is a highly regarded world-traveling photographer. Over the next hour, we'll examine the life and career of Dr. Thomas Sowell, how he rose from humble beginnings to attend and teach at some of the nation's leading institutions, and became one of our foremost social commentators.
You were a Marxist at one time in your life. What was your wake up to what was wrong with that line of thinking?
Facts.
You're about to meet one of the greatest minds of the past half-century.
Funding for this program has been provided by L.E. Phillips Family Foundation, Robert and Marion Oster, the Lined and Harry Bradley Foundation, Incorporated, DKT Liberty Project, the Charles and Ann Johnson Foundation, Chris and Melody Roofer.
Well, because I was a Marxist at the time, and they were appalled, and I said, they have very high intellectual standards, and I'm not going to find ideological soulmates. I was still a Marxist. I took a summer job in the government, got intern in economics, and it was seeing the government from the inside that turned me around. The vision of the left, and I think many conservatives underestimate this, is really a more attractive vision in itself. The only reason for not believing in it is that it doesn't work. But you don't see that at the outset. If all you're looking at is just a theory, if the world were the way the left conceives it to be, it would be a better world than the way the right conceives it to be. It just happens that the world is not that way.
For me, Thomas Sowell is that rarest of species, an honest intellectual. He spent a career putting truth above popularity. He's explored the answers to questions others were afraid to even ask. He's followed the facts where they lead and accepted the findings, however unpopular or politically incorrect. Thomas Sowell fervently stands by his well-researched beliefs, and he does not hesitate to let someone know if he thinks they're wrong. I've spent dozens of hours interviewing Tom, and hundreds more selecting stories he's told over the years to others, to help us understand what makes Thomas Sowell unique. Sowell's body of work is quite vast. It's covered everything from economics and history to culture, migration, and racial inequality.
The main thing that he's done, in my opinion, is to cause people to rethink their assumptions about all sorts of things. Not just economics, but about race, about politics, about how we get along.
Tom is absolutely fearless. I mean, he's forceful in his opinions. He will not compromise any of his opinions for the sake of social politeness.
How do you take the measure of a man, especially if he's someone who's impacted our thinking about politics and economics for more than half a century? Do you do it through his deeds or influence? Or by what he says or writes? Perhaps Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said it best. The ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in moments of comfort and convenience, but where he stands at times of challenge and controversy.
The media, the television and the print media, they've wised up. You can't argue with Tom, so you might as well hide what he's doing. And that's what they're doing. They're just ignoring what he's written because there's no way that they can argue with Tom Sowell.
What distinguishes Thomas Sowell's scholarship? First, intellectual honesty, asking the right questions, gathering the relevant data, and following the facts to their logical conclusion, even if that conclusion turns out to be unpopular. Second, the importance of incentives and the reality of trade-offs in addressing our social problems. Third, the belief that a group's upward mobility derives primarily from its development of human capital. And finally, Sowell has an abiding respect for social processes and existing institutions and the role they play in decision-making. So where did Tom Sowell's ideas come from? What formed the foundation of a man who would go on to become one of the country's foremost public intellectuals? That story began 600 miles to the south of Midtown Manhattan, more than 8 decades ago. Thomas Sowell was born in Gastonia, North Carolina on June 30th, 1930. The Great Depression was just getting underway. And like many blacks in the South at the time, his family had no electricity, no central heating, and no hot running water. Sowell's father died before Tom was born. And his mother, a maid, died in childbirth just a few years later.
He was adopted by his great aunt and raised by her and her 2 daughters. So he was raised by 3 women.
My whole career would not have been possible without the particular family in which I was raised, which was not composed of educated people. I mean, nobody in that family had ever graduated from high school, and most did not graduate from grade school. But they were interested in education, and they were interested in me.
Tom was raised by a great aunt and her adult children. The family moved to New York City's Harlem neighborhood, a migration that exposed him to better schools and more opportunities than were available to blacks in the segregated South.
My great fear is that a black child growing up in Harlem today will not have as good a chance to rise as people of my generation did, simply because they will not receive as solid an education in an era when such an education is even more important.
When Thomas Sowell was 8 years old, his family moved from North Carolina to New York City and settled here at 720 St. Nicholas Avenue in the neighborhood of Harlem. The building looks pretty much the same as it did more than 80 years ago when the Sowells moved in. Young Tommy, as he was called, ventured out into a big city for the very first time. He rode double-decker buses and learned to cross busy streets, all by himself.
We were much poorer than the people in Harlem or most anywhere else today. It was my last year or two at home that we finally had a telephone. We had a radio. We never had a television. But in another sense, in the sense of the things you need to get ahead, I was enormously more fortunate than most black kids today.
While coming of age in Harlem, Sowell discovered the magic of education, thanks to a family friend named Eddie Mapp.
In Harlem, there was a kid named Eddie that members of the family had run into before I ever arrived from North Carolina. He came from a highly educated family, and they immediately saw the implications if they could get him to mentor me.
Eddie brought Tom here to the Harlem Public Library, taught him how to find books that interested him, taught him how to check them out.
And I saw all these books, and I had no idea why we were there when I didn't have any money to buy one book. And so what am I going to do with all these, hundreds of books up on the shelf?
Crossing the threshold to this new world was the first step on a path young Tommy might not otherwise have taken.
And he very patiently walked me through the whole thing. And again, I was very reluctant to take out a library card because I didn't know what all this is about. But he talked me into it. Then I borrowed a couple of books. And really, had I not encountered him, the entire rest of the story could not have been the way it was. I mean, at some point, I would have learned what a public library was. But by that point, it would have been too late. When you start getting in the habit of reading when you're 8 years old, that's a different ballgame than if you have to wait till you're a teenager and it's too late now.
Thanks to that same friend Eddie, a young Tom Sowell was pointed in the right direction regarding his schooling. The grade school he attended in Harlem was a good one. But when it came time for junior high school, the one in Tom's neighborhood was not so great.
When I finished elementary school and they assigned me to a junior high school in a very bad neighborhood, he told me that you can get transferred. And I got transferred to a much better school. Had I gone to that other school, again, the story would have been entirely different.
He would become a firm believer in allowing parents to choose the best school possible for their children, whether it be private schools, religious schools, or even the option that sparks intense debate among lawmakers and educators today, charter schools.
There are few things more dishonorable than misleading the young.
The abysmal quality of education available in the ghettos today is one that I really don't think the worst possible private school could match. 40 years ago, I received a far better education in Harlem than the people who are living in Harlem today have available to them.
It's 8 a.m. at the Success Academy School in Harlem, New York. This is a charter school, an example of educational choice for people trying to better themselves despite the circumstances they were born into. For Tom, this is education done right.
Professor Sowell has been a leader in supporting all forms of school choice, and I very fundamentally agree that we need more choices, not fewer. I think we particularly need that for our most vulnerable populations.
Back in 1978, when there was a push for a voucher scheme, the New Republic objected. In their words, the least educated, the least ambitious, and the least aware would be left in the public schools.
Professor Sowell grew up in Harlem. I grew up in Harlem. And the schools there have been a disaster for half a century. And so you have generations of kids who have not gotten the education that they deserve and are entitled to.
Charter schools are public, tuition-free schools that are open to all students and able to operate independently from the traditional school district. They are given the autonomy to design a curriculum tailored to the needs of their students. But they must also meet academic standards set by state and local officials. Unlike traditional public schools, however, charter schools that don't meet these standards can actually be shut down.
With respect to education, Tom would say it doesn't make any difference how much money you put in education, but if there are not some basic factors that you must take into account, that is, in order for a kid to get a good education, somebody must make him go to bed on time. Somebody must make him do his homework. Somebody must make him mind the teacher. Somebody has to get him up in the morning. And if those things are not done, I don't care how much money you put into education, you're not going to get very good results. And that is precisely what we see.
For decades, Sowell has been a strong supporter of charters and other education options for families trapped in underperforming schools.
There are, as you said, many blacks today who are still being given totally inadequate education, cannot be expected to get very far for that reason. What would be your remedy for that?
I would allow their parents to have a choice of where to send them to school, whether that choice is called a voucher scheme, open enrollment, tuition tax credit, any kind of scheme of that sort that would put that power in the hands of their parents. Mainly because that would mean that the schools would have to be responsive to them. As it is now, the school is a monopoly. They need not be responsive. It is hard for me to understand what harm is going to be done by allowing parents to have a choice as compared to having self-interested bureaucrats have a monopoly.
The things that they thought were going to help did not help, and in many cases, made things much worse.
Thomas Sowell is a very private person. Despite having so much of his work put before the public, he's reluctant to give interviews and has been known to make journalists wait years before sitting down to talk about his life and work. But a colleague of mine took the time to get Tom to appear on his show.
I'm Dave Rubin. I'm the host of The Rubin Report. That's right back behind me here in my home. I do a long-form interview show. Everybody was saying, you've got to talk to Thomas Sowell, you've got to talk to Thomas Sowell. And we tried for about 3 or 4 years to hunt him down, and finally we were able to interview him. One of the things that I found out that was sort of amazing about your history, you briefly mentioned it right before we started, you were a Marxist at one time in your life. Most people will find this hard to believe, but it is true.
But it's not that unusual. Most of the leading conservative thinkers of our time did not start off as conservative. You had a couple like Bill Buckley and George Will. But I mean, Milton Friedman was a liberal and a Keynesian. Ronald Reagan was so far left, at one point the FBI was following him.
Do you remember sort of what you were thinking, what appealed to you at that time about Marxism?
Yes, I mean, there was no alternative being discussed.
I treated my interview with him as Thomas Sowell 101. I wanted it to be for the new generation of young people who watch YouTube, who listen to podcasts.
My first job was as a Western Union messenger. So I would take the Fifth Avenue bus. It would go all the way up Fifth Avenue, past all these Lord and Taylor and all these fancy places. And then I would cross 57th Street, down Riverside Drive. And then as I came across this long viaduct that turned into 135th Street, suddenly there were the tenements. And I wondered, why is this? It's so different. And nothing in the schools or most of the books seem to deal with that, and Marx dealt with that.
There's an absolutely beautiful moment where I ask him about his own political evolution. So then what was your wake up to what was wrong with that line of thinking?
Facts.
I love that moment. I mean, I knew the second he did it, I was like, we got our clip. That's as good as it gets. And it gets to, what does this man care about most? Does he care about how he feels about things?
how he wants the world to be, or how is the world as it is? Because that's what he's saying. I care about facts. The world is a certain way, and now, using that as the baseline, we can try to figure out how to make things better.
Drafted in 1951, Tom joined the Marines, where he taught pistol shooting and took photographs. In fact, Sowell was part of the Marine Corps Combat Camera Division.
Combat Camera is responsible for the historical documentation. It may not necessarily make it out to the local paper, but somewhere down the line, someone might be able to pull up an image and say, okay, this happened during this time frame. The imagery is used as good reference to anything we may need in the future or something that's happening right now.
Although Thomas Sowell left the Marines long ago, his legacy lives on today with some members of the Combat Camera Corps, who as young men discovered Sowell's work.
When I was a young person, I used to like to stay home from school occasionally, like to play hooky or pretend I was sick and stay home. But unlike most kids who'd cut class and do whatever, I would watch videos of Thomas Sowell on Milton Friedman's show, Free to Choose, and he would just wipe the floor with people from the other side of the aisle that didn't seem like know what they were talking about. These were very smart people, but Thomas Sowell was so much smarter and so much more intelligent and so much more articulate that he would just make them seem like bumbling idiots, and I just thought that was awesome.
When the private sector fails to create jobs at a fast enough rate, you find that people are unemployed and drift into needing help. I think it is overly broad to say that we turn people into helpless children.
I don't remember talking to anyone who's ever been on welfare who didn't think they were being treated like children while they were on it.
The lessons Sowell learned in the Marines would stay with him for the rest of his life, especially his love of photography, which would become Tom's artistic outlet while he pursued a life filled with studying facts and data.
Photography did have connections to his vision of reality. Tom once commented to me that to be a photographer, you have to master trade-offs. All of the little adjustments that you fiddle with in the camera never involve making everything better or everything worse. It's a matter of trading one thing off for another. If you close down the diaphragm, then you get lots and lots of stuff in focus near to far. On the other hand, you're cutting down the amount of light. And a theme in Tom's work on society is that all policies involve trade-offs, and Tom often loses patience at people with sweeping visions. Here's how we can improve society. Here's a solution to a problem. And Tom points out in his political writings, there are no solutions, there are only trade-offs. Just like photography.
The University of Chicago is hallowed ground for Thomas Sowell. Here's where some of the most influential economic philosophies of modern times were formed. It's called the Chicago School of Economics. And it's where Tom would be mentored by intellectual giants like George Stigler and Milton Friedman, both of whom would go on to win the Nobel Prize in economics.
I was a graduate student here from 1960 to 64. The thing I learned as a graduate student was economics is straightforward and simple when you grasp its underlying logic. And secondly, that logic can be applied seriously to understand many different things about the world.
You know, in Chicago, if it was true because you could prove it was true. It was true because you had the evidence, you had the logic, and so forth. They explored the specific ways in which the market does and doesn't work. The idea, that people are rational on the whole. And that if you allow those people to operate in the marketplace, you'll generally get better results.
The Chicago School of Economics is where Tom says he understood the importance of discipline and the importance of getting hard data. In fact, he talks more positively about his experience at University of Chicago than at Harvard, where he says a lot of people, in his opinion, went on emotion. Tom was a Marxist when he took a course with Milton Friedman, and at the end of the course, he remained a Marxist. But what he appreciated was that at University of Chicago, economics was a full contact sport where you had to defend your position rigorously, otherwise you got wasted. And so at least Tom Sowell said he came out understanding the importance of hard data.
I mean, I was still a Marxist after taking Milton Friedman's course. But one summer in the government was enough to let me say, no, this government is really not the answer. I mean, that is...
Milton Friedman didn't cure you, but the federal government did.
The federal government did. So never say the federal government doesn't do anything. My first professional job, I was a summer intern at the U.S. Department of Labor. One of my biggest concerns was about minimum wages. At first I thought, well, this is good because all these people are poor and they'll get a little higher income, and so that'll be helpful. And then as I studied economics, I began to see, well, there's a downside. They may lose their jobs completely, so that's that. When I was at the Labor Department, I tried to talk about that to them, and eventually I came up with some test of it. And when I came up with how we might test this, I was waiting to hear congratulations, you see, that I had this. And I could see these people were stunned. They said, oh, this idiot has stumbled on something that would ruin us all. And I realized the U.S. Department of Labor had its own agenda and interests. And that did not necessarily mean that whether poor people lost their jobs for minimum wages or got higher pay was their highest priority.
Tom Sowell looked at the data, and the data found that minimum wage hikes cause people who are unskilled to lose jobs. He found out that people in the government didn't give a rip whether or not it worked or didn't work. They were simply implementing the policy. And that's what shocked him and caused him to begin to rethink lots of his assumptions. So it wasn't academia that caused him to become more conservative. It was real life working for the government.
I was now beginning to understand things I hadn't understood before.
Tom, they said, got his PhD here in 1968. He actually taught in the years leading up to that at Cornell, which feeds back also to this just tumultuous times in the 1960s in the country. Huge demonstrations at Cornell actually shut down the university for some time.
In 1965, Thomas Sowell took a teaching position at Cornell. Like many other colleges, it became a focal point for anti-war and anti-discrimination protests and demonstrations. When armed black students took over a building on campus, Sowell had little sympathy for school administrators. Blacks had been recruited to Cornell under lower standards to diversify the student body. And Sowell observed that many of these same students were now causing trouble and feeding racial divisions. For Sowell, it was an example of the unintended consequences of affirmative action. Tom's tenure at Cornell had a very profound impact on him, particularly surrounding the campus protests. I think it left a very, very bitter taste in his mouth.
Yes, I think it did. He discovered that many black students at Cornell, their SAT scores were above the average, but they are having problems at Cornell. And that's when he first came up with the idea of people being mismatched. That is, black students who would do very well at other schools, but were recruited in the name of affirmative action to schools where they were in over their heads.
The average black student at MIT is in the bottom 10% of MIT students in math, but he is in the top 90% of all American students in math. Something like 1/4 of all the black students going to MIT do not graduate. You're talking about a pool of people whom you are artificially turning into failures by mismatching them with the school.
Tom had moved to UCLA to escape the turmoil at Cornell and then jumped into the turmoil at UCLA. I was sitting in my office at UCLA one day when the Black Student Association delegation marched into his office. I heard all of this. And one of them said, well, how you doing, brother? Tom, just a minute. I am not your brother. I am Mr. Sowell, and you will address me that way. Boy, was that a shock to those folks. Here was their natural ally laying down the law. You're going to treat me the way I'm going to treat you, as another human being face to face. And if you don't like that, you can leave.
I first met Tom in 1969 when I was a student at UCLA. I just walked in his office one day and I said that I understand that you and I have similar ideas on matters of economics. And we started talking from there.
You and Sowell used to joke about how few Black conservatives there were in the country back in the 70s and 80s. Has much changed since then? And what was it like back then?
There were relatively few Blacks that we knew of that were kind of free market, limited government. It was Bill Buckley who made the suggestion that the EPA does not allow Tom Sowell and I to fly on one plane together because we're endangered species.
Tom's done something in his career that one of his mentors, Milton Friedman, felt was important to do also. And that is share his knowledge of economics with non-economists, with non-intellectuals.
The true test of whether someone understands a subject, the true test comes when he can explain it to someone who does not know a darn thing about it. And Tom has the gift of being able to do that, to be able to explain potentially complex ideas in economics to the ordinary person.
I've been able to find a single country in the world where the policies that are being advocated for blacks in the United States have lifted any people out of poverty. I've seen many examples around the world of people who began in poverty and ended in affluence. Not one of them has followed any pattern at all like what is being advocated for blacks in the United States. Many groups have remained in poverty for a very long time, trying to follow those patterns.
At one time, Black Americans did not have the constitutional guarantees as everybody else. Now we do. But because the civil rights struggle is over and won, and we're not facing the kind of gross racial discrimination of the past, does not mean that they're not major problems. I'm very sure that Tom would say that the 75% rate of illegitimacy among Blacks is a devastating problem, but it's not a racial problem. It's not a legacy of slavery. The crime that I believe Tom would say as well, that the crime we see in many Black communities is a devastating problem, but it has nothing to do with racial discrimination.
If you have always believed that everyone should play by the same rules and be judged by the same standards, that would have gotten you labeled a radical 50 years ago, a liberal 25 years ago, and a racist today.
Thomas Sowell may be an intellectual, but it would be a mistake to believe that only academics and economists believe in what Tom has to say.
I've never heard, never damaged. I am most certainly handed single.
In a small recording studio just outside of downtown Dallas, a young rapper hones his craft.
It feels good to be back in this booth. And shout out to you, you backing me and you backing the truth. You actually knew, and I ain't have to tell you, so sit back, let it soothe the immaculate dude.
Eric July is a man on a mission.
Handed singly top tier, meaning you not.
Eric is out to make great music and to educate people like himself about his hero.
And I'm something like a great house. Anywhere Thomas Sowell is, he's the smartest person in the room. I would most definitely just tell him that he's been my biggest inspiration, hands down.
Eric fronts the rap metal band Backwards and uses his music to get a message across with politically charged lyrics, many of them inspired by Thomas Sowell. He has emerged as an influential young voice who is outspoken in his support for individual freedom and less government intervention.
You see somebody like Sowell, who has been doing what he has been doing, getting out there and speaking what he has been speaking, overcoming the odds that he had to, certainly overcome in his growth. And you also feel like you can conquer the world. It just goes to show from a generational standpoint how he's been able to influence somebody, you know, like me. People probably tired of hearing me talk about it because I'm always referencing Thomas Sowell. People ask me, well, you used to be this. What happened? I'm like, well, that Enlightenment period, it had to do with Thomas Sowell.
Most people have not recognized the fact that if you go back into the 20s, you find that a married couple families were much more prevalent among blacks then than today. As late as 1930, blacks had lower unemployment rates than whites. So all these things that we complain about and attribute to the era of slavery, those things should have been worse in the past than in the present. But in fact, they're worse in the present than in the past. And I think if you want to look for a turning point, it would be since the 1960s.
And what happened in the 1960s?
You began to have not only the welfare state, you began to have the mindset that goes with the welfare state, so that there was no stigma any longer attached, for example, to being on relief or welfare.
Those topics of welfarism and how they have affected black, communities and black families, it's tough. It's a hard pill to swallow. Just how welfarism does incentivize people to fail. It's the state saying that so as long as you fail, you'll get this money. You'll get this money, we'll take care of your housing, whatever you need. But the minute you get above this line, the minute you see this amount of success, we're gonna strip it all away from you.
In 1980, Thomas Sowell came here, the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. Upon accepting the offer, his teaching days were over. Thousands of students would miss out on having Professor Sowell as a teacher, but millions of intellectually curious readers would benefit from Thomas Sowell's work here.
I don't think Tom Sowell ever really liked being a teacher. I don't think he ever liked standing in front of people and being a professor. When Hoover offered him the opportunity to basically pay him to be Tom Sowell, he took it. And he can write what he wants to write, when he wants to write, as much or as little, but he's always been very, very productive. And I think the independence and the freedom is what he liked.
So you're good friends with Thomas Sowell, have been for a while. How would you describe Tom to someone who's never met him before?
I'd say Tom is an empiricist, and by that I mean Tom looks at evidence and then he makes a diagnosis and then he offers a therapy for the perceived problem and then he offers a prognosis, and he's not interested as much, or if at all, on how people interpret that or what are the ramifications in contemporary political terms of his argument.
You point out that depending on where you come from in a foreign country also makes a considerable difference, because you carry your ethos on your back, don't you?
Yes, that if you look at the Chinese who came to the United States, let's say before World War II, a very large percentage of those came from one district in one province in southern China. The people who've come in since World War II have largely not come from that same area. They've come in with a different set of experiences and backgrounds and values. Many of them are the poverty-stricken Chinese that you see in the Chinatowns of New York and San Francisco, working the very long hours, getting the very low pay, living in the slums, packed into the rooms, several people to a room and so on. Again, it would be hard to make the argument that this is simply a matter of the way the American employer sees it. The American employer is probably totally unaware that there are two different kinds of Chinese. It's only the people who work with the data who make those separations.
It takes considerable knowledge just to realize the extent of your own ignorance.
Thomas Sowell may be an academic by training, but he is not one to rely solely on books. To gather material for his extensive writings on culture and migrations, for example, he became a boots-on-the-ground researcher who traveled the world. As an amateur photographer, he often documented these trips through the lens of his camera. His purpose was to try and understand the role of cultural differences, both within nations and between them. And not only today, but throughout history. Sowell's travels led to pioneering studies and several books that detail the cultural patterns and development of different groups around the world.
He went around the world and analyzed virtually every culture, present and past, to find out their strengths and weaknesses, why some survived, why some perished.
One of Tom's discoveries was that much about the fate of different human civilizations and cultures can be explained ultimately by their geography.
Too often, the influence of geography on wealth is thought of narrowly in terms of natural resources that translate directly into wealth, such as oil in the Middle East or gold in South Africa. But important as such differences are, geography influences even more profound cultural differences among the peoples themselves.
Why did Europe conquer Africa instead of vice versa? Well, there are a number of ways in which civilizations become complex, primarily through the aggregation and exchange of ideas. Sophisticated cultures are ones that sit in the middle of a catchment area where innovations from other cultures can be aggregated in kind of greatest hits collections. And so geography that allows movement of people and ideas with rivers, with highways, intersections of highways, port cities tend to become more culturally sophisticated.
A lot of his research, as you mentioned, has focused on why some groups excel and others do not. That curiosity is not necessarily appreciated by a lot of people who seem to approach it from the standpoint that if a culture isn't rising, it's someone else's fault.
Yes.
Someone else is keeping them down. Or, if America is up here, it is at the expense of this group or this country or this region. He doesn't take that approach.
What Tom did when he talked about comparative cultures, he went to this quite narrow and unheralded group of scholars that talked about economics, and then he took that data, superimposed it onto history questions. So when people who were critical of Tom would say, well, he hasn't read this particular historical work, or he wasn't quite appreciative of this great novel or this great history, or this, they didn't understand that what he lost as being an economic historian, he gained in really trying to explain how cultures were successful or how much dominance they had in trade by actually looking at economics. And most historians, they think that economics is a dismal science, and they're not trained to do that.
The first lesson of economics is scarcity. There is never enough of anything to fully satisfy all those who want it. The first lesson of politics is to disregard the first lesson of economics.
I wanted to explore how Sowell's concepts on free markets have influenced business leaders today. A perfect example can be found in Salt Lake City, Utah, at Overstock.com, one of the most successful online retailers in the world. Aaron Hunsaker, an Overstock employee, has been heavily influenced by Thomas Sowell's ideas. He credits much of its success to the free market economic principles championed by Thomas Sowell.
I discovered Thomas Sowell like every good thinker discovers things in the modern day on YouTube. I was watching a Milton Friedman video and I see Thomas Sowell speaking with Milton Friedman. And I was like, wow, this guy is really, really smart. And he gave a real rigorous, as rigorous as you could be on TV, but a real rigorous answer to a question. I really appreciated that. And I just kind of went down the YouTube wormhole with Thomas Sowell. And then I saw that he'd written 10 or 1,000 books or something like that. He has tons of books. And I just started to explore him. And the more I explored Thomas Sowell, he talked a lot about incentives in institutions, government institutions. I come from kind of a punk rock hardcore background, and I had an incentive to be more left and angry because it makes better music. You don't hear a whole lot of music about, oh, well, if I work really hard and we base it off meritocracy, things will be great. But upon kind of digging into Thomas Sowell's thought process, I realized that it's far more punk rock to base things off of individual freedoms and thought. I see him as someone who has constantly strived to be consistent. And to those that want to be consistent, you have to study geography, you have to study history, you have to study political philosophy, you have to study journalism, you have to study all of these subjects as a whole and see how you can put together a view that makes them consistent with each other. That's why I think Thomas Sowell is so well versed and such a Renaissance man.
I grew up in an era when people, particularly blacks, were a lot poorer than today, faced a lot more discrimination than today, and in which the teenage pregnancy rate was a lot lower than today. I don't believe there is a predestined amount of teenage pregnancy, a predestined amount of husband desertion. Gutman has done a study of the black family showing that this whole notion that the black family has always been disintegrating, that is nonsense.
Some things are believed because they are demonstrably true. But many other things are believed simply because they have been asserted repeatedly.
In the 1990s, Sowell took up a new area of research, the phenomenon of late-talking children. For Tom, it was personal.
I met Tom Sowell through language. I am a cognitive scientist. I study language. I wrote a book on language. And I got a letter out of the blue from Professor Sowell. His son was a late talker, but contrary to some of the diagnoses that he got from so-called experts, he didn't believe that his son was retarded or autistic, just that his language was late in developing. He just did not talk. This meshed with my own understanding of the relationship between language and thought, namely, they're not the same thing. So I wrote to Tom saying, your intuition about your son is consistent with my understanding.
Tom Sowell sought out answers. Eventually, his son, John, not only began to speak, but to excel. Sowell wrote about this remarkable journey in his landmark book, Late Talking Children.
Tom discovered that there was a syndrome that many famous scientists, engineers, mathematicians would also have acute spatial ability and numerical ability, but were late in developing the ability to speak.
One of those impacted was Los Angeles-based writer Jennifer Van Laar, whose own young son, Sam, wasn't talking at all.
When Sam was about 18 months old, he wasn't really talking. He just babbling, no word that we could make out to be an English word. So I started looking online and saw Late Talking Children and then Dr. Thomas Sowell and said, oh, I definitely want to read what he has to say because I respect him as an intellectual. I had already noticed in Sam that he would build different block towers with different patterns repeating over and over. He would have movies that he just loved watching over and over, and one of them was Charlotte's Web, and another one was Shrek. And so I would come and find ABC blocks on the floor or on the refrigerator, spelling out, and even write out Lucasfilm, which is pretty big for a 3-year-old to be able to do. So the fact that Sowell's book talked about bright children, I thought, I don't think he's dumb. Let's look into this. So I went to go see Dr. Camarada to get an evaluation. And they gave us a full plan of what we could do to help him to be able to acquire language and be successful in school. When Sam started piano and he had been so advanced in that first year, at the end of the year they had a recital, and he still wasn't talking in more than one sentence, maybe two, but he got up and he introduced his piece, and it was Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. It made me cry. I sent the video of that to the camaradas and said how proud I was of him and thanked them for the help they had given us, and they asked if they could send it to Dr. Sowell. Said, go ahead. And then they emailed back and said that Sowell had really loved watching the video of Sam. Just the fact that he would care about this 5-year-old said a lot to me about who he sees himself as.
The course of history is determined by what people do with their opportunities.
Sowell has written a great deal about the importance of human capital in a group's advancement, the development of skills and habits and attitudes in advancing a group economically. And a good example of what he's talking about can be found on 6th Avenue in Manhattan at the Steinway Piano Company. President and CEO Ron Losby explains how the history of Steinway aligns with Thomas Sowell's theories.
We still follow the tenet that Heinrich Engelhard Steinweg started the company with, and that is to build the best piano possible. They were living in Ziesen in the Harz Mountain area of northern Germany. At that time, there was a lot of political upheaval in Germany, and they had the guild system. I think you would call it the apprentice system today, and it had really strict rules. And Heinrich was just so full of ideas on how to build the best piano that he possibly could that he was impatient, and he didn't want to wait until he had graduated from this system.
On his own, Heinrich created a few pianos. And while they were favorably received, the economic restrictions in Germany at the time made him realize that if he was to succeed, he would have to take his skills elsewhere.
It gave him the impetus to come to the New World, New York City, where there was less restriction, there was less, regulation.
Heinrich changed the family's last name to the more American-sounding Steinway.
They created an instrument that within 10 years, they became the most successful, most profitable, the best piano company built in America.
Very often people talk as if some group has taken control of some industry, and they wonder how did that happen? And in most cases, they created the industry. The industry didn't exist before they got there. That's how they took control of it.
Heinrich's decision to relocate to America is a good example of one of Thomas Sowell's core beliefs: that individuals carry with them their skills, no matter where they go, and can succeed if permitted to do so without cumbersome government regulations.
It's amazing how much panic one honest man can spread among a multitude of hypocrites.
Listen to this list. The Thomas Sowell Reader, 2011. Intellectuals and Race, 2013. A new edition of your classic work, Basic Economics, in 2014. Wealth, Poverty, and Politics, 2015. And now, 2018, Discrimination and Disparities. And do you know what I just did? I just listed the books you've published since turning 80.
Thomas Sowell's essays and weekly columns have appeared in more than 300 newspapers and periodicals, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Forbes, and Fortune magazines. While many found Sowell's empirically based arguments insightful, oftentimes they created a backlash, especially among those in academia.
You once told me that Tom's not interested in making people happy or angry. He's interested in telling people what the data show.
What the data shows, and he is he can be a contrarian in the sense that often areas that are unpopular or they're plagued with false knowledge or misconceptions, he gravitates toward those because that intrigues him to see if that's actually the popular opinion is actually true. And often it's not, he finds it's not. And then the results tend to bother people that he's so dispassionate about it. And then as an African-American intellectual, he's supposed to fit a preconceived intellectual, academic, ideological position. And it's not that he doesn't, he's just not interested in it. He doesn't make friends or enemies based on tribal considerations or popular consensus.
On December 27, 2016, Thomas Sowell published his weekly newspaper column. I'd read his column for decades and always looked forward to it. But this one was different. Thomas Sowell was saying goodbye.
Within minutes, the internet lit up with thousands of comments about Tom retiring from writing his column. Most of the postings were along the lines of, "Say it isn't so."
I did that after spending some time in Yosemite with a couple of photo buddies, and I realized that in those 4 days, we hadn't watched a single news program. We hadn't seen a single newspaper. I said, this is the life. I don't need to be watching it, because most of the foolish things that are said on these programs were said 20 and 30 and 40 years ago, and refuted 20 and 30 and 40 years ago.
By you, quite often. But you're happier when you're not reading the news.
Absolutely.
But at the same time, you're also happier when you're working on a book.
Yes, when I can go out there and get the hard data and find out what's really happening.
In dozens of books and numerous television appearances and thousands of columns, Sowell has championed his philosophy of free markets and personal responsibility while weathering the storms of challenge and controversy. Sowell has spent his adult life proudly sharing his political and economic beliefs. For some, he's a clear thinker full of common sense. Others say he lacks empathy. What no one can doubt is the courage of this maverick intellectual.
If you could offer one sentence of counsel to some sophomore or junior who's watching this today.
It's not over till it's over, as Yogi Berra said. And I would say to this young person, if we through some miracle get through this, please take to heart the lesson of what happens when you vote on the basis of rhetoric and symbolism and instead of using your mind. It doesn't matter how smart you are unless you stop and think.
In your early days at Harvard, you were either going to make it or not going to make it, and you shut yourself up and made yourself make it.
Many people are trying to insulate young people from adversity, insulate them from the things that give them strength.
Thomas Sowell, Common Sense in a Senseless World is now available on DVD. For more information or to order a DVD of this program, call
Okay. I thought that was pretty interesting. Well, we have a lot of people on Zoom. That's awesome. Okay, well, thank you all for watching. One thing I would like to point out, I should have said before it started, this documentary makes Thomas Sowell look like untouchable, infallible figure. And obviously it's not. Everybody has problems and makes mistakes. So like if you disagree with what Thomas Sowell was saying or thought was controversial, that's kind of his point. He says a lot of things that are controversial, where people look at the same data, the same hard data that he kept talking about, and draw different conclusions. So it's important to remember that when we watch these kinds of things. This was just to make Thomas Sowell look great, and I agree. I think he's a great guy, but if you disagree with that, that's okay. And so now we're gonna have a discussion. This is the main part of this event is over. So if you have like somewhere else to be, that's okay. That's this discussion portion that we're going to have is optional. So, but if you'd like to stay, you'll get to hear from 4 panelists: myself, Eric, Dr. LeGrand, and Dr. Schenk. I hope you guys thought of some questions. I'm sure many of you did if you heard a bunch of new things. So if you have any questions, or just want something to talk about with the class, or not really the class, the group, just bring it up. And I'll invite Dr. Schenk and Dr. LeGrand to come up. I guess we can socially distance these chairs a little bit. But if you have question to the group, you may ask, or if you would like to ask one of us something, how we feel about what was said, go ahead. And those on Zoom, if you want to put it in the chat or mute yourself, we're not special here. You can just mute yourself and talk. So, and this mic, which is how you're hearing me, to whoever is speaking.
Did you guys need to have those things?
Yeah, that's what they're recording. Wow. Yeah, and this was
the college gives us lavalier mics. We could have brought one in.
It also would have worked. Okay,
I asked you to email.
I asked both.
To bring them up?
I never see the information about this.
I did email this morning. Okay.
Oh, well, that's why I didn't read it.
All right, so if anybody has any questions, Benjamin?
Dr. Shane, what did you think of the punk rock section where they're talking about?
That was awesome. I had no idea that someone else would be a Thomas Sowell fan, would also be a hardcore punker. That was, totally that was wonderful to me. I mean, and the guy was right. All right, don't let the tattoos fool you. He was right about this. Being left-wing upset and accusatory is extremely popular in the punk rock world. If you want to really sort of get in on the punk rock world, that's an easy way to do it, right? But there is another strain within punk rock, and that is you don't get to tell me what to believe, prove it. And that is there. That is part of punk and hardcore punk is I'm going to think these things through for myself, and I'm not going to let you tell me what to believe. And those two are at odds, and I think he chose the better of the two.
Well, I was going to ask you a question too. Similar to Thomas Sowell, were you also a Marxist? But I guess
I was never a Marxist. Okay. I'm not that big a fool. But I was a Chomsky anarchist socialist. So.
What's the difference?
Oh. Okay. The Marxists really do believe in violent revolution. And they believe in a centralized state prior to the emergence of the classless state. And they think that that centralized authority is necessary in order for the socialist revolution actually to work. And Marxists make no bones about this. That's why I can't believe there are faculty on this campus who are Marxists, because this is a school started by pacifists. Don't let them lie to you about this.
Well,
Marxism explicitly and expressly, Marx himself said it, Engel said it, they support violent revolution. Noam Chomsky does not. Noam Chomsky is a lot closer to the pacifist left-wing socialists and is like no friend to the Antifa crowd that we have nowadays. See what I mean? They're very different characters. No, I was never a Marxist because I saw what control freaks Marxists turn into as soon as they get control of it. Whereas the Chomskyan socialists really, frankly, we meant it. And we really didn't believe in a centralized sort of control where the control freaks could gain authority over how to set the economic value of some commodity or something like that, or tell people which ideas they were permitted to entertain. Marxists love to do that. Chomskyans don't. It's very different.
Okay, thank you, Professor Shane. Yeah, sorry about the mic setup.
Dude, it's all right. You work with what you got.
We do. Okay, so so Benjamin's question was, how does Dr. Shane feel about punk rock? Considering the one guy at Overstock.com. Are they really having that much trouble here?
No, I was just seeing if there's any chats.
Oh, okay. The guy at Overstock.com was also a punk rocker, so So, any other questions? Or ideas, things you thought were interesting that we can talk about? This is a discussion.
Oh, Josh Carter has a question.
Josh Carter has a question.
Yeah, I guess I was wondering what the panel thought about Thomas Sowell's idea of letting parents choose what school their kids go to. How do you think that would work out in reality if we did do that?
Well, my own personal view, I think school choice is great for most of the reasons that Thomas Sowell mentioned, that if you're in the neighborhood of a bad school and you can't switch schools, then I guess you're out of luck. But if you're able to like go to a different town or do a different district, then you'll be able to get to a better school, and the schools that are doing poorly will do poorly and lose money and eventually go out of business. And so schools are incentivized to have better outcomes for students and to, I guess, get better teachers as well, because that's often what happens in the public school system. They have a monopoly, like Thomas Sowell said. So there's not really incentives to improve. My own mother saw this and homeschooled me and my siblings almost the whole way through all the schooling. So for my own personal example, I think school choice is. You want to say something, Dr. Shane? Or
of course.
Dr. LeGrand?
I think one of the things, I think the question was, how do you think it would work out, or what would happen? What would happen, maybe some of us have read about this or seen other documentaries on this, in cities, and this is often a big fight, but where there is an opening to charter schools, there is a tidal wave. People get in line. I'm blanking on the documentary about the lottery for charter schools in Harlem. What's it called?
Waiting for Superman?
Waiting for Superman, exactly. So poignant. I mean, this is seen as, if not life and death, opportunity versus stasis. So I think those scenes speak very well. Now, I think on this point and others, we were mentioning that this is only one perspective. I think it's a fine and a wise perspective, but I guess I would just go on the mic here. I would note that one of the things that sort of I think rubs people the wrong way about this, right? It's a very sort of popular opinion. There seems something sort of crass, I think, to many people about privatizing education, right? Often the response is, well, don't you believe in the public sector? Don't you believe in the public good, the common good? We have to have some things which are in common, we share as a society or as a nation, and this sort of individualistic and atomistic, I'm putting it in the terms of critics of Sowell, that would be the kind of thing that they would say. But I think it's also important to as was emphasized here, to study the data, to collect the data, to analyze it, to study it, and to see how well some of these institutions are serving us. And in many cases, it is really heartbreaking how far the public schools in New York has fallen from the time when Dr. Sowell was educated there to the time when the recording was made this very day.
Okay. I regard public education in this country as one of the biggest running disasters it's had in the past 100 years. I think the fact that you have a system in public education, it's not serving the public good. The idea is for it to do so. I think Jim is right about that, but it hasn't been serving the public good. What it has been serving is the tenure of underperforming teachers who have no incentive to change, because when they do a bad job in their teaching, basically nothing can happen to them. And when the school is underperforming, basically nothing can really happen to it. And so they have no fear of phoning it in. And so they do phone it in. And so in grammar school, kids don't learn grammar anymore because their teachers don't know it. So how could they teach it? school choice is like the one and only thing that stands to pop the ideological blister that public education in this country has become. And I am whole hog in favor of it. I would love to see a full-on, not just a charter program, but like a full voucher program across the country. I would support that unequivocally because I support wholesale school choice unequivocally.
This past year might prompt a little bit of energy in that direction. I think there's a lot of
This past year was, I mean, it really showed you just how much educational achievement is not the goal. And it's not the fault even of the teachers or even of the administrators in the school districts. It's the fault of a system wherein its goal is to perpetuate itself. The bureaucrats' most important concern is to perpetuate their own position in the bureaucracy and the bureaucracy that they serve, not the students or the teachers that are in it. I don't blame America's public school teachers for this. I blame them for a lot. I don't blame them for this. The fact that students are not actually learning very much in public education, even in some of the better public schools these days, in large part isn't their fault. They're being given umpteen regulations regarding what they are allowed, what the teacher is allowed to say in class, what they're allowed to teach in class. They are basically forced now to teach to the test, which means they're just trying to get the students over these hurdles that have been put in front of them. They jump through the hoops, excuse me, is the better metaphor for it. And actual educational attainment simply cannot even function as a realistic goal in the system anymore. That's not the teacher's fault. That's the bureaucrat's fault.
Yes, I have a follow-up question. So for Dr. Shandy, Dr. Logan, you are educators. I'm sure some people here and many of our friends are education majors, and it's probably more economical to go into the public school system than to go into the private school system because private school teachers are often paid or underpaid. So
I'm looking forward to it.
Oh yeah, you as someone who's going into the public education system,
teacher next year, baby.
What advice do you have to people who are either conservative leaning or just Christian going to the public school system?
Give me that.
I don't know if that was a good idea.
Learn to grow a spine and stand up for what you use people's chosen gender pronouns when she is Christian and doesn't believe any of those lies. But I'm still a tenured professor, so I can call those lies lies, and I just did on tape on recording. And if they want to come for me, please do.
You're already out, though.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, is, what are they going to do? So she has to navigate that. She has a much stabler position because she is in public school. And it would be a pay cut to go to private. But I agree with Rod Dreher on this. You've got to stand up for what you actually believe in, for what you actually believe is true. And if the only real challenge to doing that is that you make less money, but thereby are able to serve God and God's kingdom, please tell me, what is money in the face of this? That was my contact.
Yeah, I'm certainly very sorry to hear this experience. I think it's important to have, as you were mentioning, to have supporters, literal supporters, but also intellectual and spiritual support. So my sort of primary, I don't have a lot of experience in this, but my primary suggestion and advice is develop your own network. anyone who is ideological or intellectual minority, that advice, I think, is appropriate and even necessary. Can't rely on sort of standard professional training, standard professional development. Some of my colleagues would put this more vividly and richly, but that's much of that's garbage today, right? So you sort of have to go through that.
That's my songs, Trace Edward, come on.
I'm not gonna look at yeah. But you need to, and you know, there's some good news here, and I think there is. There are many, many opportunities now with the sort of decentralized systems we have. A lot of garbage out there on all sides of the spectrum. There's lots of material that's brilliant, that's truly contributes to your professional development in various ways, and it's free, like this, right? We didn't put out the hat upon entering the door. You never do. YouTube's, some of us are concerned about some of the things YouTube is doing, but they do have wonderful things like, isn't this where we watched it, I think? Like this documentary. So you need to find your own way, but find your own way with like-minded and wise colleagues. That would be my advice.
That's good advice.
Okay, Eric also has a question.
So, I like playing devil's advocate. My question is, 50, 60 years ago, we did not have the same level of charter schools or private schools for kids to go to. And I find that maybe the public schools were doing so well back then because they didn't have that competition against them. And now when you start introducing all that competition, that pulls the students out of those public schools. And that's why they're turning to rock. And I think that's wherein lies the issue. I feel he is, again, going against what he's saying. He's saying everything was better, 50, 60 years ago.
He didn't say it.
Right. How do I fix this?
Like in Harlem.
Yeah, Harlem was better 50, in terms of education, 50, 60 years ago. Not everything else. But what was the difference in the education? The option was all public schools. From my understanding, there wasn't any privatized education. I think once privatized education was introduced, that is the problem.
Okay. Would you like to respond to that, Dr. Shankar? Dr. Rubin?
I mean, even if it's a devil's advocate argument, I think there is a point there. I have read and talked with people that really do wrestle and struggle about whether to leave a public school. It's a little bit the same situation about people who are in a really dodgy neighborhood. It's not good for them, and it's not good for their bikes that constantly get stolen, and for their children and all the rest. But they think this is a little bit of proof texting here, that if you'll allow it, they're a little bit of salt in life in this neighborhood, right? They play an important role. On that level, I can sympathize with that. I think there need to be, I hope, right? Please God, continuing good and virtuous people in all of these institutions, even if they're going downhill. But on the I think you're sort of suggesting this. I don't think that bears out. There's many, many other factors that are much more important, I think, in the decline of public schools. Simply read, I'm an American historian. There's some really wonderful, interesting memoirs that speak of young people's, even children's experience with school. One of them I've assigned before is by a Jewish girl. She's chased by anti-Semitic pogroms out of Bologna in the late 19th, early 20th century. So we're going back a little bit even before Sowell's time. Family settles in Boston, dirt poor. It's called The Promised Land. You've never read a more sort of heartfelt, civic, pious love letter to America And one of the things that strikes you is how fundamentally different education was then and now. It wasn't just the competition that changed it. There are factors relating to sort of cynicism about tradition, and I won't go into all the things, but there's all sorts of sources of weakness, and even I think some might argue sources of rot in the public school system, apart from the competition. But I do wrestle with that, right? I mean, there are gonna be people, back to the Waiting for Superman documentary, those people that don't get the number. Who's gonna be there for them? I understand the pain there, or the anxiousness there.
As do I, but I agree, the rot doesn't come from competition. It comes from unaccountable bureaucracy. We didn't have a Department of Education back then. We did have private schools back then. We didn't have the number of them because we didn't have the system for having charter schools, right? And especially like right, one that I'm not big on, that I'm down on, the online charters are, from what I've seen of a lot of them, pretty underperforming, actually. But that kind of technological availability, right, that just wasn't there 50, 60 years ago. I mean, the dream of the internet, I don't think was there 50, 60 years ago, really, right? But one big change that we had, and I don't think it's a good one, I used to. And back when I was a socialist, I really liked it. And what really cured me of socialism was getting to know more socialists. That was what did it. We didn't have a Department of Education. There weren't all these bureaucrats overseeing teachers and trying to tell them how to teach and what to do and what the entire educational life from day to day was supposed to be. They would get their training and they would go do what they were trained to do. And I think that was a much better way of doing it than what we have now.
Okay, we've been talking about public education for a while. Brandon, what's your question about education? It is. Okay. I was hoping to move away.
His hand's been up a while.
Okay, I guess I'll ask.
Like,
Brandon, what's your question?
More than half of this got started.
I don't really, I'm not super interested, but what would you? Brandon is my good friend. Brandon is my
It's gonna go way over your head, so I understand.
The people on Zoom don't know he's insulting you. Brandon has insulted me back.
Don't worry, Brandon.
Okay, there's a slap and a counter slap online, people.
So we recognize that there is a major flawed system we have going on with education, at least on the public level for high school, elementary, what have you. So we're talking about implementing a voucher system or a private system overhaul to our education system. And the thought there is, well, if we make it more competitive, the school's going to have an incentive to perform better. And then this way, the schools that do perform better, more students will attend those. And the idea is they'll make more money. Well, what's the measuring stick there? What are we using to actually show that school A is better than school B? Are we using exams that are designed by the college board? Are we using exams that are nationally distributed? What stops school A from saying, well, let's just teach the exam better than school B does? We've got better numbers in terms of these AP tests. So we're therefore a better school, and really they're just pulling the same tricks that these public schools are doing anyways to float their numbers up to make them look better. What's the metric? And if there is no national metric, what makes Stanford University separate high school A from high school B? Like, okay, you've got a 4.0 average here, and he's got a 3.5. Well, maybe his 3.5 is better than your 4.0. Where's this universal measuring stick? Who makes it? How do you solve that?
So Brandon's question is, if we want to support a more like market-based schooling system where there's actually incentives to do better without an overall universal system of measuring which school is doing better than others, then how are we going to know they actually are? And they're not just training for the test or fudging the numbers in their own favor.
It's a great question.
It is, but I don't think that I'm gonna go out on a limb here and try to guess what Sowell would say. If you sort of think about the logic, the premise of what you're describing there, some body, some organization, some system has to make this determination. I've never met Sowell, but I'm quite sure he'd say that's not the case, and that's not what he's talking about. I think what Sowell would say is simply let parents choose. And some parents will choose on the basis of perceived difference in the success of teaching trigonometry. Some parents will make that choice based on who their children are becoming. We hear a lot about holistic education. True holistic education is one of the weaknesses, certainly, of public schools today. Many public schools, not all of them. And so there'd be many parents, I think, that would be taken, and they'd make their choice by the fine young men and women in the making that they see coming out of these schools. That's, I think, what Sowell is getting at. He's not saying, it's very different than saying this school gets like a 5-star rating and this is the Ivy of the charters in South Central Pennsylvania and South Central Los Angeles. He's just saying, let parents decide based on whatever metric they choose. That's very messy, it's very decentralized. It is, to a degree, sort of libertarian. That's why it sort of freaks some people out. But I think, particularly given the situation today, I think that's exactly right.
It's Brandon, right? Yep. It's an awesome question. It's the right question to ask. I don't know what Sowell's answer is, but I'll give you mine. Sure. Do you have Amazon Prime, Brandon? I do. Good, me too. We buy so much stuff off there, right? Yep. When you buy your stuff off of Amazon, you check the reviews first, right? In my case, religiously. And I don't just go with whichever one has the highest reviews. I read the reviews, because stupid 5-star reviews, right, tell me something about the reviewers. And 5-star reviews that are all pumping the same thing tell me something about the reviewers too, all right? Like maybe these are Chinese bots or something, right? Like that. And some companies will even, they'll give you a kickback for writing a 5-star review. That's a good thing to learn about ahead of time before you decide what to buy. I think especially now in the 21st century, not having some centralized bureaucratic system that does the ratings, but instead leaving the ratings to the parents who have very many opinions, strong ones, about what is happening to their children. And they will take the time to write thank you reviews of the schools they have looked at and their kids have attended. And you don't let any of the schools try to censor them, right? That information gets out. You even have a national clearinghouse for it. You can give it to the Department of Education to make sure that that clearinghouse is there and that reviews don't get censored, right?
So we're going to trust them to do that.
Yeah, I've been just a little sarcastic with that. Right? But you see what I'm saying? I mean, this is easy to set up and cheap to set up and easy and cheap to maintain. Like no sweat. I think that would work excellently, and I think it will work better than putting any of the sort of measurements for success and failure into the hands of bureaucrats. That's the David Chang case.
Thank you, Dr. Shank. I also agree. So in an effort to move away from public education, since we keep talking about it, there are many topics covered in this documentary. So are there any other points you'd like to bring up, Crosby?
So he has some strong points on racism in general, and particularly recently. And he points it back to the facts speaking for themselves, essentially. Do you agree that the facts do speak for themselves in that respect, or do you think that there's a missing piece to the puzzle?
Well, so Crosby's question was, Thomas Sowell said over and over that the facts speak for themselves with regard to racial issues, especially modern ones and disparities. And do we feel that there are pieces missing? I would say, before we answer all the questions, that people do look at the hard data and come draw with different conclusions. I would say that Thomas Sowell is very intellectually honest and cares a lot about his audience and the kinds of recommendations he's making. So I would probably agree mostly with Thomas Sowell without having a thorough education of these issues. But I guess we'll hear what our panels would recommend.
I'm going to give it to Jim first because he's worked on the subject. I have.
Yeah, I appreciate that question. Modern American historian, studied African American history, teacher, of course, on education. Here's my thoughts on this. He's absolutely on target and on solid ground regarding the issue of the family. I don't know if you caught the book he's mentioned there. There's a legendary scholarly monograph by another socialist. That's most humanists, right? In Herbert Gutman. Herbert Gutman's The Black Family and Slavery and Freedom. And it studies family formation. It's a remarkable thing. In some ways, it's an inspiring thing. See, after emancipation, under great duress, with not 2 cents to put together, to rub together, how committed so many African Americans were to family formation. It's a remarkable thing. So at a time when any person would have to agree that there's more challenges, more duress, the family was not affected as much as it has been since the 1960s and 1970s. That said, I think there are some places it doesn't sort of obliterate Sowell's argument. But you notice he doesn't talk about things like redlining and restrictive covenants. These are things that you're familiar with that keep African Americans for decades and decades out of home ownership. Home ownership, particularly in the 20th century in America, is a way to build family and household wealth, and wealth that can be passed on from one generation to another. There is clearly an unequal and asymmetrical, call it what you want, way in which that affects African Americans. It is true that the U.S. economy during this time, essentially the time that Sowell lived, has been enormously dynamic, and there is opportunities to, as the documentary shows, to sort of start new businesses, even start new industries. All that said, when African Americans came north, he actually comes sort of in between the two largest movements of the first great migration around World War I and the second great migration of the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s. Scholars have studied this and found that it's tighter, right, to enter these industries. The Polish immigrants, the Italian immigrants, and those who control steel and construction and other industries aren't as interested in hiring many African Americans. So I do think there are some, this is a term we hear a lot, maybe some of us are tired of it or have different thoughts on it, but I think it is true. We have to admit there are some structural matters here, some structural challenges and disadvantages. But some take that so far as to sort of be totally uninterested in what the documentary noted, which is the importance of human capital, right? That helps explain Thomas Sowell's advance and so many others. So, as I say, I think there is something to that. The way I sum this up is when you're studying history, there's a lot of facts. There's a lot of data, right? And he's not inaccurate and wrong in the data and the facts that he drew on. There's always going to be more.
I'm not an historian, so I mean, I can't really speak to that side of the question. I distrust jargon and I distrust the people who peddle it because I always suspect they're trying to sell me something, so I try not to use the academic jargon generally, right? Structural, I still consider a good word. And I think that's right. I mean, I won't call it systemic or institutionalized, right? I mean, I'll call it deep-seated, I'll call it stubborn, I'll call it long-lived, I'll call it widespread. Because those are terms we can all use and understand honestly, right? I won't even call it racism. Let's just call it racially affecting disadvantages, right? A sort of level of disadvantages where some racial subgroups get affected more than others. And I'm not going to even speak about the reasons because there are way too many bold hypotheses about that, right? I do think that's real. I do think, even though it's a lot less today than it was 100 years ago, or even 60 or 70 years ago, I think there's still a bunch of it, I do. But who you are, your personality, and especially your moral character, is not decided by the adversities you face. It's decided by how you face them. And if I face them by blaming someone else always and complaining about it, if I face them by being angry at the world that has, in fact, mistreated me, I don't get shaped by my will to overcome, I get shaped by my anger. That's a big mistake. I understand it as, I don't know that I was bullied quite the way Eric was, but I was bullied plenty because, let's face it, all nerds get bullied. You know, I haven't seen a school where that doesn't happen. If you're homeschooled, right, you're all a bunch of nerds, then it doesn't happen perhaps, right? But for those of us who go to public school and you're a nerd, you get bullied. I understand that anger, that resentment, that pain really well. But if we don't let go of it, it can destroy us. No, I think that those problems are there. How we respond to them, though, is what decides who we are. Oh, come on.
No, I agree with Dr. LeGrand. I was going to say that, we read the facts in a book, but when we sit here and look around the room, what do we see? I'm sorry to say this, but I think we're all white here. Is it okay for me to say that? I don't know anymore. So there's got to be some disconnect between those facts that they were reading and the facts that are sitting here in this room. And I don't think from my position, I can say what those facts are. I don't even know if anyone can say what those facts are. But there's definitely a disconnect.
Hey, Eric pointing out. Your lived experience sometimes does not always follow the facts exactly. But I'm sure there are always, like Dr. LeGrand said, many reasons, many facts to everything that happens. Okay, we have 2 questions. Matt?
Yeah, so Dr. Sowell talks in his talk about like the whole welfare state and how like a lot of times like with the welfare state start out small and then it kind of balloons and stuff. And I've noticed that a lot of people like right now we have like not just a lot of African Americans on welfare, but I think most of the welfare might be like immigrants from like Latin America. So like I'm not really pro welfare. The funny thing is that like I'm Irish, but like I grew up in my family comes from Philadelphia, and we got out of poverty. Like my generation, me and my brother, are the first to go to college, and both my parents died, which is a pretty big deal. So we work with the bridges, but a lot of people, for example, like in Appalachia are Irish, and they're still, the car because they're on welfare. So like, I remember Sowell talking about like getting rid of some welfare programs. Like, I don't know like if any of you know about what exactly he advocated, but like maybe if you don't know like what welfare programs we would probably start to graduate the country out of. Because like I'm really concerned about the national debt, and how like, for example, I think like Medicaid for like all the elders was like exploded in 15 years. It's just like really concerning me.
And so Matt's question is, Thomas Sowell addressed the welfare system and how it can produce bad outcomes, even though the intentions were good. And what would Thomas Sowell, or I guess this line of thinking, would advocate as a how to get out of it, and I guess like, what to replace it with? Was that good, Matt?
Yeah.
Right. So I guess like Dr. Thomas Sowell mentioned at the welfare state, changes incentives. So like one recent example that we can probably all agree with is that like during the whole COVID lockdown, people were receiving unemployment checks disingenuously, and like I'm sure we all have either friends or family who did this. I have some who were receiving more in aid than they were making at their job. And so that removed their incentive to look for other jobs or to or try to get their old one back or try to push for it. And so like in our small businesses who are getting paid to be closed, if they weren't a very like efficient or profitable business before, then why would they do that after? I'm not saying that that's exactly the case, but that is an example of the government taking away incentives when that's probably like the best way to succeed is to have incentives to do so. So that's just one example I can think of. The panels.
So you raised a lot of issues there. I'm inclined to sort of separate and disaggregate them a bit. The budgetary issue, which is real, but that's overwhelmingly in Medicaid and Social Security, which is quite different historically, and I think in other ways, than social welfare. Regarding welfare, I think what Sowell, it's interesting, as you were asking the question, I thought to myself, it's interesting this never came up. This is maybe even before you were born, around the time you were before. We've been through a huge welfare reform movement. The sort of bad old days that sort of appear in this documentary are the 1970s, when there is, one of the, was this phrase used, but people like Sowell and like me talk about even the law of unintended consequences. That when there are these bureaucracies, reform movements like social welfare coming out of the war on poverty and the Great Society in the 1960s, that aims at what it's aiming at. It's not as tight, it's not as accurate as that. So there's lots of unintended consequences, some of which are arguably the dissolution of families. It was part of this, it was called the man in the house law. And if it was a man in the house, and benefits went down. You see where this is going to go, right? It's a disincentive to have a father, to have an adult male in the house. Anyway, so I would separate the sort of budgetary issue from this. I personally believe that welfare reform, although not perfect, was a wise and beneficial thing. I think we're in a different place now than we were in the 1970s. And one last thing, just to sort of note here, welfare doesn't only relate to incentives or to budgets. I was thinking of a somewhat different kind of conservative public intellectual, but another really brilliant man. I don't know if any of you have heard the name Arthur Brooks. He used to be the head of the American Enterprise Institute. I think he teaches at Harvard's Kennedy School now. But he came to Messiah actually and taught. He gave this talk other places too. But several years ago, social scientist, different kind of social scientist in some ways than Sowell, but he did a study of happiness. And one of the things that he found, this extends across all races, men and women, all income levels, actually, quite remarkably, that happiness is increased when there's a sense that you have earned it. Not when you get a check, not when you get a handout, as high as that might be. So there, I think in some ways, most of us would say, well, that shouldn't be a surprise. But this is, again, a data-rich and really rigorous study that shows the negative influences, I would say, even sort of on the soul, to a system that relies too much on handouts from the government.
Okay, so we are running low on time. I want to be respectful of everybody here. We have like less than 10 minutes left. So I would like to reduce it to one answer per question if there are more than one. So I think Riley, you have a question?
Yeah, I was curious about the documentary mentioned immigration, and it talked about it in the context of Steinway and the piano company. It talked about in that way the Germans moving to the United States based on lower laws and regulations in New York City than there were in Germany. And I think the tide has slightly changed now, but we're still seeing immigration to the United States. And so I'm wondering, what is the main cause of immigration today as opposed to Sowell's time?
I can answer that. I'm sure you guys have a fuller answer, possibly. Okay, so Riley's question is that in the documentary mentioned groups and people like Steinway or and other companies, businesses, industries that came from different countries because of the lower regulation in the United States. And Riley asked, is that true today? So a few examples I can think of is, although like the industriousness of America is probably not as powerful as it was back then, although we are like the leading producer in so many things, the ability to just walk up, start a business, and then become like the founder of an industry is probably a little more difficult today since due to like larger corporations or just a lack of new opportunities. So like in the technology sphere, there is so much immigration or immigrants in the technology sphere. So like you go to these like the tech giants or even tech startups that like they specialize. There's so many like Asian Americans, Indian Americans, especially you go in these businesses, but they come because they know that these are very profitable businesses. And if you come to America, it's still the land of opportunity, especially if the country that you're born in has less opportunity. And also I don't think we often think of America as being a regulatory state, but that's all.
Go to Germany.
I know, compared to other countries, that's still not as much as the case. Like, I had a missions trip to Haiti one time, and one of the problems that they have that learning from the like missionaries and the society there is one of the problems that they have is they have like just as many regulations as we do, if not more, but they're like more strict in how they carry them out. So it's harder to get a job because there are just so many competing interests in their government. So Dr. Sheng said, go to Germany. Like the more regulation and control that the government has over business, the less room there is to succeed or rise above the others. So like examples like the Steinway Piano Company or Guinness or other companies that came from Europe or wherever. That's not, it's harder to do today, but it still is possible. Okay. Erica has a little thing to add.
I think also as we're pushing for education and getting people into the schools and going up to higher levels of education, we're not always realizing that we need people to do those lower level jobs. Like I live in Florida. I live about a half an hour from Plant City, where strawberries come from. They have to be picked by hand. If all your workers are going to white-collar jobs, who's going to pick the strawberries? I think that's where part of the immigrants come from as well, because there needs to be people to do those jobs.
Yeah, there are many different jobs for people to fill that isn't just tech jobs that are still important. So any other questions or thoughts on the documentary? Ethan, I have a question. So Thomas Sowell's a famous economist, and he's constantly like researching economics, and also, okay, this also has to do with education. But what do the panelists think is? Do they think that like since economics isn't really taught in high school, at least like the important aspects of economics isn't taught nearly as well in high school as it should be? Do you think that is that something that we should do? Like, should there be greater education regarding economics because of how important it is and how little a lot of people know about it? So Ethan's question is, Thomas Sowell is an economist, famous economist, and Ethan's asking what the opinions are about integrating more economics, or at least the important side of economics, into high schools, and if that will probably solve some problems. Why?
We should just go down yes or no down the line before we answer.
Okay, what does Eric say?
I say yes.
Eric says yes. I say yes. Should we have economic?
Yes or no?
I'm indifferent.
Indifferent. Dr. LeGrand?
I say no, because I'm gonna invoke Sowell here, trade-offs, right? You can't just add economics.
That's exactly right.
And keep all of the literature and the art and the other, and the reading. I'd say just send it to the websites.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just gonna give them another subject to like be lukewarmly educated in and not really know much about when they get out. How's that help?
Okay, so Dr. LeGrand and Dr. Schenker are in agreement that there are trade-offs in education. If you add something, you gotta remove it. You gotta remove something else. Sorry, Ethan, if this isn't a wonderful answer, but one great example that I always hear is I see all these things on social media like, oh, I have no idea how to pay my taxes, but I know that the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. And like all these things over and over, like I all know all these very
not know how to pay your taxes.
like I didn't learn this in school. I didn't learn how to apply for grad school. I didn't learn how to apply to college, but I know that the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell.
Aren't you gonna tie your sew a button or iron a shirt?
But one example was if you taught kids about tax brackets and how taxes are paid and how taxes are made, such as like on the stock market, or if you make money, the more money you make, the more money you have to pay, and also how people can get out of it. Like if we gave a rigorous education on tax policy, there would be a lot more conservatives graduating from high school. Because just learning about how the system works.
There would be a lot more loopholes exploited.
And there'd be a lot more loopholes exploited. Which, like the internet has contributed to today. I think of the example of the stock market. All the weird stuff going on in the stock market recently is because of the public is getting knowledge about the stock market. Okay, but so we are running down on time. Is there any last minute questions? This will be the last one. Benjamin.
So I wanted to ask Dr. LeGrand, do you think it would be good to, so I know history is often, not always, but it's sometimes taught from the political standpoint. Would it be beneficial to teach it also from an economic standpoint? To talk about the economics of why people made certain decisions?
Okay, but Benjamin's question is, since history is taught in schools, from a more political point of view, would it be better to teach it from an economic point of view? Dr. Linder?
To a degree, yes. But there's trade-offs here as well. There's not only political and economic history. There's social and cultural history, and intellectual history. Maybe we even have in the room, I'm sorry, you're going to be disappointed, but there's not much military history anymore, but that used to be a big field. So this, I I do sympathize with, I think, the spirit behind it. But at a certain level, it's sort of making, I'm not gonna get the categories right, but it's making Dr. Schenck sort of into a different kind of philosopher, right? Couldn't you be this kind of philosopher rather than another kind of philosopher? I guess I'd say, I mean, I wince too when people say they don't know how to read a balance sheet or there's some place for sort of personal finance, but you know, even as a teacher, I can say this, not everything you learn has to be within a curriculum or inside a class. And we live in a time now where there's lots of things that can be learned on your own. The key is to go to the right places.
Right, thank you, Dr. LeGrand. So, thank you for all the questions and for sticking around to hear the answers. Thank you all for coming. Are there any closing remarks before we all get up and go back into doing the drudgery of homework?
I'll get one.
All right, Dr. Schenck.
This is the guy who turned me, he is the guy who turned me into a free market capitalist. He's the reason I finally just completely abandoned socialism. I was already walking away from the left after seeing their control freaking, right? But I was not a free market capitalist yet. I started reading Thomas Sowell. I actually read Milton Friedman first. He's brilliant, but I still just wasn't quite buying it. Sold me completely.
And if you want to even deeper education, just work for the government.
That's Thomas Sowell. That's a darker path.
I want to say, it's okay not to agree with us. It's okay to disagree with everything Thomas Sowell said, but that doesn't mean we all agree, or mostly agree, on problems. It's just we disagree on solutions. And so Dr. Sowell is very big on solutions that work, and although people disagree on which ones work and not, I think we can all agree that there are problems today that need to be solved, and that we should try our best to do so. So thank you all for coming. I hope you have a good rest of your day. And thank you for watching this recording, if that's what you're doing. Eric,